Hello, welcome, and thank you for tuning in to this conversation. I'm Miriam Kessling, Events and Engagement Manager at Sherwood Arts, and I'm really pleased to be introducing our guest speakers that you're about to hear, the artist Freya Dooley and artist, curator and producer Helen Frosi. This conversation has been programmed to coincide with our current exhibition, Sherwood Solo Presentations 2021, which showcases new commissions by Emmy Ulroy, Freya Dooley and Bryony Gillard in 3 concurrent solo presentations at Sherwood Arts, which you can see until the 17th of July 2021. Diverse in content and materials, the works in the exhibition span sculpture, installation, moving image and sound, with each artist taking over a whole gallery to present their ideas. Now in its 5th year, Sherwood Solo Presentations creates a much-needed platform for early career artists to make and show new work. It provides a fully resourced opportunity for 3 artists to develop a significant new commission at a pivotal moment in their career. And the resulting exhibition creates unique space for conversation and experimentation across and between disciplines. Sherwood Solo Presentations are selected and curated by Harriet Cooper, who is the Head of Visual Arts at Sherwood Arts. Helen and Freya are going to be in conversation about Freya's new commission, Temporary Commons, an immersive multi-channel sound installation that describes the experiences of connection, untethering and futile attempts at control within the porous walls of a rented terraced house. A meandering fictional narrative voiced by the artist weaves together dodgy plumbing, turbulent neighbours, bad weather, canned laughter and an invasive landlord. The tension of hidden leaks and unstable structures is a stage for reflections on the harmony and discord of living alongside others. Before I hand over to Freya and Helen, I'll just take a moment to introduce them both to you. So, Helen Frosi is an interdisciplinary artist, curator and producer whose practice pivots around ecological thought, poetics, aspects of gifting and alternative forms of economy, with a focus on the creative, social and political dimension of sound, hearing and listening. Her practice manifests as process and necessitates collaborative, cross-disciplinary work, communal projects and collective activities. Helen curates Longplayer Day, a festival focusing on time, duration and long-term and ecological thinking, with James Bulley, and is co-curator of Auraldiversities, an ongoing series of workshops and seminars on the auraldiverse turn in the arts and humanities. Her latest project, Encounters, sits at the nexus between art and ecology, with a focus on the sonic imagination. Helen is Director of SoundFjord, a nomadic cultural platform focused on sound-related research and practice. Founder of Visible Near Midnight recordings for works that fall between the genre gaps, and is a visiting research fellow at Goldsmiths at the University of London in the Department of Music. Freya Dooley works across media encompassing writing, moving image, performance and sound in her practice. Her work builds layered and unstable narratives, collaborative fictions that navigate their way through divergent subjects, expanding outwards from close-range environments and observations. Freya lives and works in Cardiff. She graduated with a BA in Fine Art from Cardiff School of Art and Design in 2011 and was a member of Syllabus 3, a UK-based peer-led alternative learning programme in 2017 to 2018. Dooley currently holds a 2-year fellowship at G39 Cardiff, which is supported by Freeland's Artist Programme. In 2020, she undertook a residency with Dept projects in Japan, supported by Wells Art International. And recent solo exhibitions and projects include Scenes from Between the Mountains and Sea at Dept project in Japan, Ventriloquy for Radio, which was part of Interruptions at Holden Gallery in Manchester, New writing with new contemporaries, including performances at Leeds Art Gallery and South London Gallery. Somewhere in the Crowd There's You at Eastside Projects, Birmingham. And The Song Settles Inside of the Body It Borrows at Chapter Gallery in Cardiff. She was also shortlisted for the Kleinwort Hambros Emerging Artist Prize in 2019. So with that, over to you, Freya and Helen.
muscle, bone, fat, fluid, muscle, tissue, bone, gas, fat, air, fluid. All of these things next to each other, each other. That's what we call the
To begin, for there is always a beginning, an almost void, a space that is virtually absent of light. A place that absurdly or perversely is welcoming despite the fear of unknown knowns, unobjects, unsubjects. This darkness in architecture that envelops reveals itself, its watery marblings, its elusive edges, its tympanic language of communication and triangulation between one porous membrane, that is to say a perceived body, the listener, another architecture, here in a predominantly oral configuration, the work, and a mesh, network, or tangle, the melia or ecosystem one listens within. I offer my body space and body ear over to immersion, a condition that involves a leap of faith, a heart leap of trust stroking the hairs and arms to say, do not worry, your corporality will be taken care of. In this offering I am vulnerable to influence, to novel navigations, to the undoing of understanding. Knowledge, with its weight and pressure, acts as a fixative, to the unravelling of structures I know so well that I do not remember to acknowledge. I am knotted and undone, so much so that of my parts that I thought separate and distinct, they presently vibrate in multitudes, synchronously with the atmosphere. I as one, and now always as many, am submerged. What to expect? What am I hearing, and what am I hearing with? What to listen to in all this? To listen at all? I find my position, a void within a void, a potential, or what's known in this situation as a seat, drenched in sounds from above. In distinction, I perceive a narrator shadowed by exasperation, anxiety, and tragedy. Plots spiral from the humour of situation and irony. Minor irritants, also known as neighbours, pick unwittingly at surface tensions, deflating and confusing the more than human worlds as they live the minuscule significance of their everyday in the magnified glory of teleporting TV theme tunes. Pernicious forces, such as the Landlord, are characterized, often ventriloquized or appropriated by the narrator. It's her chance to possess a little of his power and to boast incredulity as lassitude to anything other than an overstuffed pocket. I let my body do the listening, and in that listening I evaporate into the space of the room. I become the room, and the room becomes me. I am attending to the overarching form, structure, and systems that patrol, organize, and process here. For one, to reappropriate the term from Lisa Robertson, what I'll call a soft architecture, an orchestration of supposed and colliding bodies of water in various fundamental states. In it, human corporeality is figuratively condensed, tormented, and confined into being. Something is not quite what it was before. Alongside other vessels, bodies traditionally characterized as inanimate, they are contorted, bloated, weathered into being. Something is not quite what it was before. Simultaneity brings destruction as antonym. It also breathes life into non-biological matter, although not necessarily in a form we yet appreciate. Whether as a character, its gestures constitute atmosphere and create it, metaphorically speaking. As a current, a pressure, a stress, this meteorological phenomena casts itself as pathetic fallacy and prognostication tool. In its watery logics that seep to the inevitable sea, water knows how to get home. It does not respect human-made boundaries or barriers, nor the power structures that constitute human politics, and this is where we might learn something important. In weather, its utter and complete banality reveals it to be an invisible stealth, hidden in the plain sight of everyday small talk. It might be raining in your own home, but would you recognize it as such? Over time, weathering reveals the layers that have been purposefully hidden, weakens the divides that ultimately separate and disempower us. In a collective state where a distinct irritant is now a mirroring of self, and the self is dispersed afar from one's broadest notion of the holobiont, beyond the dichotomies of Western thought, a water-drenched body is itself perfumed by the politics of matter and energy. Like aqua, I digress from the other structures and systems that covet and control company into austerity and singularity. Drainage doesn't just come in steel, copper and plastic. A landlord does a good job too, siphoning off your independence, offering misery and precarity with every rental agreement. Instead, I linger on elements that describe another narrative, as sonics that are called music. That is, of course, a contrary term and subject to argument, especially so when your neighbour plays too long and too loud into the evening. Here, however, distortion, visceral rumbles, recurrences, and leitmotifs are to be considered a nuanced lexicon. Goethe once stated that music is liquid architecture, and with that logic, it can be said this particular musical narrative reveals a saline topology that is, can I say this, non-orienting? Let's say it's outsides or it's insides or it's outsides. Before you're even aware of it, you're perturbed, disturbed in places, broken by earworms and reconstituted in lush tonal shifts and polyphonic rhythms. Always brought back to the extended self, multiplied and gorgeous. All of these things next to each other. All of these things next to each other. All of these things next to each other. Perhaps then the soft architecture of the weather in its aqueous constellations is a creature always in the making, a relationality of becoming between betweens. As a substance insubstantial, evanescent, and the fabric of everything, this is where we begin.
Hey Freya.
Hi. How are you doing?
I'm really, really well, and I'm really excited to be here. I just want to thank Miriam and Jerwood for inviting me, and also for you as well for giving me a punt so we can have a chat together about your wonderful, wonderful work, Temporary Commons. So that piece you just heard was a text response and now a vocal response to being inside the installation itself. It felt like it needed to be hybridic, not quite meta, not quite ekphrasis, not quite stream of conscious, because it feels like the work that you've created is a work that's always in creation. It's always changing into being. There are no fixed points. And I've added grain onto the tape because I feel like your work reminds me also of The Stone Tape. It was a television show from 1972 written by Nigel Neal, and I think it was broadcast on BBC Two as a Christmas ghost story. And the idea is that protagonists move into a Victorian house and they start to hear strange sounds that seem to be embedded into the walls of the house. So it feels like there's this connection between your work and the Stone Tape TV show, which is also a radio show, by the way, in three-dimensional sound. And I think the connection is really beautiful in that because there is so much bleed, there is the narrator who is a character, there are the neighbors who are also characters, there is the house, which also could be seen as a body, you know, the body of the voice, the body of the neighbors, the body of the house, and also I feel like bodies of water. I think we can talk about weather and climates as systems that also come up in the work in a little while, but it feels like this pulling out and constant shifting is really, really important in the work. And I would love you to talk about that constant shift, really, that movement, that flow, that well, there is never solid ground. When you think there is, something shifts and you're somewhere else.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of the stone tape when you mentioned it in our first conversation. I have looked at it, and I love this idea of the house as a recording device. And it made me think of, or I was thinking when I was writing this a bit about my grandparents would always leave the radio on for the pets. And I also, one of them said once that it like warms the house up, these kind of sounds and these voices. And that always stuck with me, this kind of companionship, I guess, of voice or the radio or listening. This feeling of shifting and this, I kind of really enjoy the instability of writing, or sometimes it feels like writing is a way for me to pin things down or to organize my thoughts or feelings or observations or whatever. It feels like an untangling for me, but I can never quite settle. And that kind of life in the text is the thing that is sort of infuriating, but also like the thing that I enjoy about it. So yeah, that shifting to me is important, because even though this work is really sort of dense and layered and, you know, there's not always a lot of air in it, but there is room for shifts and for the listener and for other thoughts and voices and interpretations and associations.
I suppose there's so much porosity within the work. So, I mean, water is a kind of metaphor for, or a conduit in a way.
Yeah, I think in terms of the porousness, that is how I feel about constructing work in the first place. And so there's this kind of negotiation or like structuring of experiences or stories or whatever it might be. So that word porous really sticks with me as a method of making, that there's a kind of absorption of lots of different things that can be lots of different things.
So I think if we talk about sort of porosity, there is a lot of that within the work. There's water as a metaphor. It seems fundamental within the work because, you know, it's there in lots of different states. It's subtle, it's in the air, you don't see it, you don't necessarily perceive it, but then it's also coming down as rain, and then it's, you know, in aquifers under the water creating sinkholes at certain points. So I think as a kind of character in its own right, water is quite interesting in the way it, you know, obviously the material of the house and the human body facilitates that kind of porosity just by its biology and its material. But I feel like water is also this kind of conduit for that kind of change and that shift. And obviously it kind of builds up over time.
Disorderly weather sets the scene. The thunder could split rock. Heavy rain, a relentless headache.
They don't call this fallacy pathetic or
I'm counting the beats of every passing hour, minute, second that I am still not asleep, still not asleep, still not asleep. The rain announced itself out of nowhere, banging on the window. Restless, I can't settle. My mind tears through all thoughts at once, falling from a very great height, and then, in a moment of clarity, fixates on just one scene, saturating the surface, soaking into the pores of the finest minor detail. In bed with the rain, one thing leads to another. Extreme weather patterns and persistent downpours cause leaks. Soggy buildings compromise the ground they sit on, and soft structures lead to sinkholes. Now I know what you'll say. That fluctuating emotions, feelings of insecurity, precarity, may prompt fears that some might call irrational. But irrationality is immeasurable, and nothing is impossible, or, on better days, anything is possible, especially now more than ever, apparently. Water seeps down through surface soil and gradually dissolves the rock beneath. There are hidden cavities underground, growing undetected, little by little, until the floor falls through without warning, and the slowest of time becomes all of a sudden.
I wanted to start the work with this description of weather and atmosphere. I really love the collection of, would you describe it as a collection of poems? But the book, The Weather by Lisa Robertson, who you also mentioned in your introduction, I'd sing a different text by her. But the weather is so heavy. It sort of holds so much and it's so affecting, but it's also this really banal small talk thing that we're all living under. There's she describes it in the introduction as a temporary commons, although I've sort of taken that term out of context. But this idea of this kind of communal, in a way, a communal experience was really sort of interesting to me in its kind of mundane Britishness as well, I suppose. And yeah, also it's a kind of almost a cliche to begin a story with a description of the weather and to sort of set the scene in that way, or locate it somewhere which is specific but also incredibly general. And I suppose the weather is this kind of metaphorical illustration of sort of turbulent emotional states, or all of those things which are kind of, quite cliched in a quite a self-aware way, but also it does affect you, this invisible force of the weather or of atmosphere or of pressure. It's both a small kind of domestic detail, but also this huge, changeable, unpredictable, affected and affecting thing.
Exactly. I mean, you totally do set up the scene. I think the first line is disruptive weather sets the scene. So straight away, there is an inkling that the weather is a kind of maybe trickster character, something that you can't necessarily pin down to it just being rain or wind or sunshine. There's always something that it does beyond itself, I suppose. So I was really interested in weather being quite a distinct character in its own right. But I mean, you also touched on this idea of weather and pressure, obviously atmospheric pressure, but also pressure, stress, a heaviness. And I think, kind of atmospheres being kind of socio-political as well, especially at the moment, we're kind of living through kind of a state of anxiety, and that's the least of it. So I think the pathetic fallacy that you talk about is interesting, because I think that kind of sets up, again, the sort of the character, the kind of human or human-like nature of the weather. It's going to be messing with your mind a little bit as well as your body and pushing you in lots of different directions. Actually, your work reminds me, or I was reminded of some writing by the late John M. Hall. He was a theologian who went blind later in life. He wrote a book called Touching the Rock, and I think it was also made into a film called Notes on Blindness. That was quite a recent production, where they took, in the film anyway, they took elements from his notes, his diaries, where he talks about his blindness. And actually, rain becomes quite a big or it seems to be quite a huge feature for him because it activates so much. With his blindness, as soon as it rains, everything is activated. He can hear the sound of the raindrops on objects in the distance. They all sound very different. So I suppose it's a little bit like maybe the notion of echolocation. You can do a click sound with the top of your mouth, or animals can also produce their own echolocation, like bats and whales. And they create a kind of sonic picture. So he is kind of creating an image in his mind of what's around him. And I kind of feel that that's also what you're doing in the work when you're using the weather, or should I say right at the very beginning of the piece. It might just be the introduction that you use when you have an installation, because I know that the installation is looped. You have that kind of watery pattering that gradually escalates and escalates. And I think the main reason why it made me think of him was, and it might be a complete mishearing, I heard those raindrops as if it was inside the room. It also sounded, it sort of switched, so it sounded like it was in the room, and it also sounded like it was outside of the room. And in his notes, he talks about wishing it would rain inside. And obviously in the film, they make it happen. You know, there are huge raindrops everywhere on the armchairs, on all of his sort of technologies, on the windowsill, on the windows. You know, it was quite a dramatic scene, and it really stays with you. And I think also with your work, that use of liquid, watery logics seems, again, I repeat myself, but it seems absolutely fundamental to the work. And I wonder if you did want to talk about how you use those metaphors, those atmospheres that you create through weather and through water within that piece.
Yeah, just to pick up on what you said about this feeling of inside and outside, that's a recurring theme or occurrence in the work in like different forms. So in the installation, although there's a beginning and an end, it has a sort of weak narrative arc, I guess. But in between, to give a little bit of breathing space, there's this kind of 3 minutes of rain. You probably would pick up on it more in the stereo version, but there's this kind of frequency shift that sort of changes the qualities of that, or also when you hear it for a long time, it becomes something else, like any sound or word that's repeated. And to begin and end with the rain, Emma added the rain at the end actually, and it was really nice because it ends with kind of sinking underground or being underwater, and then the rain starts again. And so there's this literal loop, but also this feeling of things coming back up to the surface. And then when it begins, the rain hits the ground, and then there's a sort of description of this kind of porous soaking in or furrowing down, which in a way is what the writing does as well. There's a lot of sort of, and this conversation, I'm sure, like a lot of divergent seepages into other kind of areas. And so that's how the rain kind of operated for me as a sort of starting and ending point.
I had this idea, it was just a kind of interlude into the piece, but also it felt like actually really important to have this feeling of inside and outside. And again, sort of looking at scale, you know, like tiny amounts of water adding up to lots of amounts of water, which also have an effect on the house and the psychological state of the person, the narrator. Because, you know, they're anxious, but also things kind of build up on that anxiety as well, don't they? And the pathetic fallacy of the weather outside and water kind of coming in and seeping in and leaking out of all places. I mean, even the language that you use it sort of loops back onto those terms of leakage and seepage and, yeah, flowing. And, you know, there's never kind of that solid wall. It almost feels to me, I mean, if we talk about sort of scale, kind of zooming into almost the insignificances of everyday life through to like the huge complex issue of the climate crisis or something.
Yeah, I suppose it's worth saying that the kind of central premise of this work, or like the beginnings, that the protagonist has this anxiety that the water from outside will compromise the structure of the building because sinkholes are formed by, and I'm probably going to paraphrase this really badly. I'm definitely not a scientist or geologist or whatever the ologist is that studies sinkholes, but the water basically gets diverted into places where it shouldn't be. And so it sort of causes these unseen shifts underground. And I guess there's this idea of these kind of malevolent, invisible things that happen that have a wider impact on daily life, or inaction causing wider problems, or ignorance causing wider problems. So yeah, there's some of that in there, though it's not explicit, and I don't sort of profess to make any huge claims in the work, but those are definitely thoughts that inform the anxiety of the premise of the work. I mean, anxiety finds its way in all the time to these narratives that I make. So yeah, I mean, also it's impossible, even though the work isn't explicitly about the pandemic, obviously it was created over that year, and so there's this also the threat of outside and inside, and this kind of very acute awareness of boundaries and walls and skin and body and invasion and control. All of those things are always felt for different reasons, but obviously become more acutely contextualized in the time that it was made and shown. So yeah,
I think what struck out in quite a distinct way for me was, as you were saying, that those membranes, so what constitutes the human body, say what constitutes the house, what constitutes the environment, what constitutes the ground beneath our feet. And it felt like at certain points, but maybe even from the start, that you're never quite sure whether the narrator is talking as the house, or as the narrator, or as a narrator, or as the neighbors, or as the landlord. And there's always that kind of shift, or that not quite being sure. And I think that's what makes it so exciting also, is because as you're listening, you're always being flipped in your perception. So one moment that you're listening to a narrator speak, but also there's this feeling like, even though the narrator might be talking about the house, it almost feels like it's the house talking about itself. And so I think the notion of what constitutes a body is really interesting. I mean, Astrida Numansis talks about bodies of water. The human body is a body of water, we're 60% plus water. I think our brain is a bit more, maybe. And our lungs definitely much more. So, that we're kind of filled with water. We are water. We're constituted of water. And also, like, the environment around us is also water. So the atmosphere, as we previously talked about, is filled with water vapor. Again, it's something that we don't necessarily perceive as humans, but it's definitely there. So it's like, where does one body start and where does one body end? I mean, maybe there isn't an answer to that, but just that kind of playing around and trying to work it out, which I think comes across really well in that work, that kind of shifting. So, kind of sovereignty of the body as a kind of discrete thing is never quite there, even though, this idea of wanting to be in control, you're wanting to be in control of your body, even maybe this idea of imagining that we're not a body, like being in our heads too much, which I think, kind of Western culture tends to lead us more towards the head, or should we say where we feel the mind is. So thought is sort of upstairs. So I'd love you to talk a little bit more about sort of, you've already talked a little bit about sort of bodies and seepage, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about sort of your working with that, your sculpting, and maybe not even sculpting, maybe that's completely the wrong term if it's something that is unable to be fixed. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about all of that.
I think it's so interesting that you just, when you were describing the mind and then you use the term upstairs, like that's so interesting to me. Like we use these kind of parallel images all the time. And I guess I was thinking about water and the body, well, or leakage in the body in relationship to landscape and voice has kind of come up in other works and more kind of explicitly in a film that I made in Japan. And during that time, I was thinking a lot about maintenance. And so I think there's something in this about where you talk about control, where it's also about, and sovereignty and things like that, that it's also about ownership and maintenance and responsibility and all of those things as well, and how those things are controlled or compromised. And so there's this kind of, or two things maybe to talk about around that. One is the character of the landlord and this kind of feeling of invasion that happens, or this entitlement that the landlord has to this building which he owns and is responsible for but doesn't care for, and a kind of idea of living temporarily, like we all do. We're all temporary. And an idea of occupying a house temporarily or renting, caring for something, maintaining something which doesn't belong to you. And being cared for as well, or how the house can be something which can be a kind of site of care, but also a sort of antagonistic force depending on your circumstances. The landlord character in this idea of dominance and invasion and ownership, and in this narrative, the landlord owns a whole row of houses, which obviously is a common thing that happens, and this sort of level of responsibility that he does or doesn't feel.
Yeah, there's definitely a duty of care that he doesn't fulfill at all. And I just remember during the piece, he slides under the door. He's a very slimy character. And also this notion of, I mean, if we talk about sort of sharing things, this idea of sharing one's drainage system with the neighbours, but also, and I think you've spoken about this before as well, how he's also a drain. You know, he doesn't give anything apart from, you know, in this case, insecurity, you know, and anxiety, because everything is, and if we talk about skin again, this idea of patching things up, you kind of cover the surface, but what's happening underneath, it's all festering, you know, the wound is festering.
This house, which I like to pretend is mine, is nestled in a terrace in the edge of the city. The house lives a porous existence. There is no stillness, or if there is, I can't find it. Everything bristles with potential, with traces of past occupants. All the other lives in transit, absorbed in the walls. We are all temporary tenants. Landlord visits regularly, always without warning. Exercising his professed rights, he lets himself in, slopes under the door, slippery. Most of the houses on this street have similar layouts. Some are divided into flats. Landlord owns half of them, patches up his patches with surface renovations and postured improvements. In imperfect conditions, the buildings age in tandem, some with more dignity than others. Ruptures and wrinkles, broken plumbing and peeling skin. Unable to take responsibility for their own maintenance, the states we're in.
I'd really like to talk about time now. That's not just because I'm a curator of Longplayer. We're obsessed by time here, but I think time is really interesting in the work as well, and that maybe relates also back to scales and porosity. And I'm thinking a lot about temporal measurements and rhythms within the work. So maybe within the kind of the character of the music itself, which just to say, I feel like there's a couple of characters, from the weather, the atmosphere, and the narrator, through to the musical, the lyrical elements as well. It kind of feels like a character is telling you something. So I'm gonna offer it back to you to talk about how time and temporal measurements feature in the work.
I wonder whether it's worth also sort of introducing the soundtrack in some ways, or like how the soundtrack operates in a kind of more formal way. So I collaborated with an artist, a musician called Emma Diamond-Thomas, on the soundtrack, and the sound, or the music rather, kind of carries the carries the narrative. So all the music is original. There was this nice sort of back and forth between us, or that we kind of shared that we were working remotely. We began together. I stayed in the caravan where she lives, and that was how we sort of got to know each other a bit more. We already knew each other, but got to know each other better and in this different context. And then because of the way that the exhibition shifted over time, our sort of friendship and conversations developed, and that conversation with Emma was really the thing that formed the work. So she was very much part of it before I really knew what it was, before I'd written the script, and these things sort of formed fairly organically. Yeah, that sort of process of collaboration was really new for both of us, but I really wanted to work with a musician because the way that musicians work is inherently collaborative, and it's a much less self-conscious or embarrassed way of working than I'm sort of used to, or like there's sort of less privacy in your sort of workings out, I guess. And that was really interesting process for me to be able to share those sort of vulnerable aspects of making the work with Emma and working things out together.
Yeah, actually, so along with the music, there's also the field recordings. When I talk about field recording, it sounds from beyond the studio, really. So in this case, the sounds of water dripping, which could be inside, it could be leaky taps or pipes. It could also be a rainstorm outside. I think sometimes it's a bit maybe ambiguous. And I feel like those sounds seep into the kind of musical elements where they actually become, don't ask me to define what music is, but it feels like it becomes more musical. So you get sort of polyrhythms forming from layering of these water droplets. And then you maybe get some MIDI or some synth sounds in there that kind of accentuate that. So I suppose I was interested in how music and time completely are interlinked.
Landlord lets himself in again today. Big body in a small space, a cold rush from outside. I keep my shoes on. He is here to check on, but do nothing about the leaks, which I've chased around the house with empty vessels and old towels. The damp has spread and redecorated the walls with mould.
I was thinking a lot about how those rhythms come into the work, and also what they say about the work at that particular time. So, I mean, this was maybe a slight aside, but there's also there is a leitmotif, I feel like, for the Landlord, where there's this kind of deep, visceral sound. You feel it in your body, and it's one of those sounds that makes you feel a bit uneasy. Like I don't know, it's almost like the sound of a house before it falls down. It's kind of very deep in the pit of your stomach, kind of anxious sound. So that's not necessarily relating back to time, but I'd be interested if you wanted to talk on kind of rhythmic polyrhythms within the work, but also the distortions within time as well. So that it feels like there are maybe songs that you're referencing that are sort of distorted or slowed, and I think that also kind of changes the listener's perception of the space, the work, what's happening.
There was definitely, to talk like in quite a sort of basic formal way about it, an idea of pacing or tonal shifts that happen through the sound and the music. It's really nice that you picked up on that motif of the Landlord. That was a conscious thing. It was interesting because when we started working together, I was describing the soundtrack as sound, and it was sort of difficult for us to kind of work out what it was until we started terming it as music. And that was the way that Emma felt more comfortable thinking about it, but a way that I would never have called my work music before. So it's just so interesting, like how you define terms.
Hello, my name's Emma Damon-Thomas. I'm an artist and musician, and it was really a great experience working with Freya on the sound for Temporary Commons. I usually operate in the kind of music industry sort of world, like I play in a band called Islet and I release records and play gigs and that kind of thing. So creating sound and music but outside of that context was a really refreshing experience for me. I love Freya's writing and it was great for me to make snippets of sound and music and think about atmosphere and texture without having to think about words at all, because they were taken care of. That's her vision. So that was really fun for me to do. I loved seeing the whole thing come together as well over quite a long period of time in a way. It felt like quite an honour to be able to see her ideas come together and go through that kind of like beginning, tentative first thoughts and, you know, moments of doubt and uncertainty, and then see it all come together and become this new creature at the end. That was really thrilling for me. We worked on the sound over the winter of 2020-2021, which was bleak for nearly everybody on the planet. And the house that I'm living in was fortuitously, it appears, leaking from multiple points. There was a lot of outside coming in. That's how I describe where we live. It's in the countryside and there's a lot of rain penetrates on a regular basis and pipes burst and those kinds of things. So it was actually quite nice that I got to record some of the drips, and it felt like there was perhaps a higher purpose to all this dampness, that it got to be useful somehow. The plumber Andy that appears in Freya's script is a real plumber, and he was very good because he didn't mind me following him around with a Zoom recorder, recording all the buckets and drips and gurgles. We recorded the sound in dribs and drabs and bits and shared them on this platform that I absolutely love called Splice, that Freya introduced me to, and I hadn't actually used Ableton barely at all until this project, so that was really fun getting to grips with that and being able to share stuff. What I really like about working with Freya is because she thinks about atmosphere and texture and how it's going to make the audience feel, rather than thinking in a kind of song structure kind of way. And that's a really exciting place to be, I think, as a music creator. So I really enjoyed that. I felt like I had a lot of freedom in the music that I was able to create for this. I'd send Freya bits and usually she would quite like it. We kept the elements quite simple. It was mainly voice, two synths, like this Arturia microbrute analog monophonic synth that does the kind of bassy stuff, a microkorg for the more arpeggiated stuff, some MIDI, and there's like one snippet of bass guitar, so it was quite simple, and I really like using that mixture of analog and highly digitized kind of sounds as well, so it feels really synthetic. One piece of equipment that I used loads was the TC Helicon vocal effects unit, which is really digital, and it's got loads of presets that are like Barry White for doing karaoke and things like that, but it has loads of sort of endless digital effects, which I found really, really useful and really good for looping as well, to make the sort of character of the water and the rain.
part of the reason that the work is purely sound and not film is because there's this kind of shifting or transformation that happens when you're listening that just felt too rooted with any visual anchor points. So the way that, you know, a dripping tap or rain on the window pane, or these things can transform in scale and musically, or become embedded somewhere else or take you somewhere else. I felt when we were making this that it could only happen if it was an oral kind of space. So yeah, these kind of rhythms that carry the narrative in that way. There's also something about the way that the narrative is constructed, or the way that the kind of story is told. There's a sort of slightly indefined idea of time. Everything's written in a present tense, which isn't the way that you would normally recount your experiences conversationally. And also there's this sort of stretching of time that happens underground. So the idea of like a sinkhole would form over a sustained period. There's a mention about the ocean being a finite thing. All of these sort of references to time that sort of folded into this very present experience of a sort of domestic disturbance, I guess.
And that actually links really beautifully to a previous work that you've done. I forget the actual name of the installation as a whole, but there's a work within it called The Host, which has elements of the earworm and in the text that I wrote to you as a kind of response. And initially, I did have this earworm in my head, and I actually still have it. So when I go to bed at night, this earworm tends to pop up a little bit more.
Is it the all of these things?
All of these things next to each other. But what I also love about that is it kind of references a relationality, and again, like that kind of shift of perspective when one looks at something maybe out of place. So there's an element in the work where the landlord is looking out of the window and sort of gossiping to you. Sorry, I say you, I mean the narrator. My gosh. So the landlord is looking out and becoming the work. Well, it feels like art is following life when the plumber is George Michael's ex-sound engineer. I mean, wow. So the landlord is looking out of the window and gossiping, and the narrator is, I think, seeing what's being left outside. It looks like a house is being emptied. There are items kind of strewn, I suppose, in the melee of a move or a removal from a house. And there's a fridge that's on its side, and there's a chair, and the chair has got sort of marks on it where someone's been sitting. And I was thinking about all of these things next to each other in terms of that chair would feel like so normal and everyday inside that house. The person is no longer alive, it seems, and now this item is just outside in the street. And the way someone would look at that item now moving forward, it's sort of like tragic, but also it's kind of intriguing. There's a story to it, but it's a completely different story or narrative that's placed around that object. Now it's kind of taken out of its, I don't want to say original context, but a context that it had been in for a while. So, enough to sort of get those greasy head spots and hand spots. What did people used to use to not have those antimacassars? I think my gran used to call them.
Is that what they're called, like on aeroplane seats or coach seats? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I guess they would be called antimacassars. That definitely reminds me of my gran saying
that's interesting, the kind of weight of something when it's removed from context, when it's isolated. And I think that phrase, which actually is it's a quote, but I can't find the original source of the quote. So all of these things next to each other, that's what we call the universe. That's a paraphrased quote by Jorge Luis Borges, but it's mentioned in another essay, but it's not directly referenced. So I'm not sure the origins of that, but yeah, that phrase really stuck with me. It has this kind of beautiful poetic weight to it, but it's also in lots of other ways like direct, and there's a kind of humour in it.
Is it worth talking about scale a little bit more? So, I was kind of thinking about the everyday, which maybe seems insignificant to these systems of, I suppose, even oppression, with just the landlord being a landlord and you're renting, they're taking your money for something that you... And I think the weather being just, oh, isn't it a beautiful day? Like I always say to people, oh, enjoy the sunshine. And then I kind of cringe because I'm thinking about like the climate crisis, and we're enjoying something that actually other people, maybe in the global south predominantly, are actually affected by in a really negative way. So it kind of feels like scale is important because there is this shift between bodies, but also what these tiny, possibly insignificant acts when you're just at home doing your thing reveal over time. So
yeah, I mean, that's a really helpful observation. I think, yeah, there's things that are alluded to in that you've already touched on. But yeah, I mean, like as an example, this sort of microwave meal and this like plastic container that's going to outlive you, or so towards the end of the piece, this leak which is happening in the attic that's in the space that the narrator is so sort of responsible for maintaining, is the sort of deluge that happens next door, and it's only heard. It's not they don't see that happening, they just know that it happens. And so there's a sort of, as much as there's these moments of connection throughout the narrative, or these moments of sort of communion or parallel or sharing, there's also, yeah, these kind of wider impacts of something. And also, sorry, this is dotting around a little bit, but also this sort of image of the terrace and this kind of feeling of a shared space, which is also compartmentalized. And this idea of individual experience affecting collective experience is very interesting to me. And this breaking down of privacy that happens as well. But I think that everything, again, like feels contextualized in a very specific way at the moment. And I was at one point quite reluctant to make a work that was so domestic. But I also just have always had interest in these sort of micro gestures or occurrences or anecdotes, and what they can kind of, on with a bit of attention and speculation, like what the wider kind of implications of that thing. And in a very sort of physical way, the way that the sort of plumbing system connects across the terrace, and the way that the plumbing system connects with eventually the sea, and this feeling of being tethered to something bigger than you, I think is a sort of wider thought or interest for me that maybe isn't explicit so much in this, but it definitely underlies a lot of things. I read at the beginning of like many people, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic on immunity, and Ulysses talks about this idea of the social body and being kind of responsible for each other, and being each other's environment. And I don't know, that really struck a chord with me.
The couple next door have woken up on the wrong side again. We share a wall, a drainage system, a landlord, and an alarm. My circadian rhythm has been forced into harmony with theirs. Their bodily functions resonate through every room. I often lie awake to their grunts and groans, deemed by the council as natural noise and therefore illegitimate grounds for complaint. Their morning alarm repeats, relentless, every 10 minutes on snooze, again for an hour. I slip in and out of my dream states, matching the pace of their morning reluctance. The two of them exist in exchangeable modes of anger and pleasure, and I have no choice but to tune myself into the daily soap opera of their comings and goings here in my room. We know each other intimately by now, though we've never actually met. Nor would I want to at this point. I just couldn't face the embarrassment. It's gone too far. Our boundaries have been compromised the walls between us have cracked. In the evenings, the television next door is so loud that there is often a stream of Britain's Got Talent contestants auditioning in my living room. I listen along for approval, cheering, laughter, and for disdain too. A search for reason infiltrates every scene of pleasure and production. One of the contestants, a ventriloquist, is booed off stage. The double voicing, a possession turned public spectacle, is laughable, but in a bad way. Grotesque, awkward. This contestant is trying too hard and the audience can tell. Almost infantile in the fantasy of the suspension of disbelief. Channel hops to the news, no. A sitcom, yes. Closed space, open time, neat and finite. Comforting, with a laughter track in lieu of an audience. Ha 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 ha, finding its way through into the rhythm of my evening meal. Canned laughter was designed as an instruction for emotion, to supplement the dialogue with energy, and also to teach us to laugh alone. The laugh track is made up of individual murmurs and tittering, layered together to synthesize a feeling of joy, companionship, camaraderie. I join in, laugh along, though I can't quite catch the jokes. Later, we share an old and familiar tragedy, and simulated sobbing reminds us how and when to feel.
It makes me think about how much we're kind of told to think as an individual. So we're kind of made to think sort of in a, we talked about like these discrete objects with borders and edges. And when I was asking you about time, I actually was thinking about the circadian rhythms also. So the neighbor is waking up, the alarm clock is going off, the narrator is changing their life to sort of mirror or fit in with the neighbor's life. I guess it's a necessity. And I actually, in my own personal life, I find that I stay up later in the evening because it's quieter where I live. So again, I'm kind of shifting with my surroundings. And I think we're probably all doing that, aren't we? All the time. It's just not necessarily at the front of our minds. So that certainly came to mind. And I think we've talked about commoning quite a lot in terms of shared space, whether it's wanted or not. This idea you talked about privacy in terms of, I guess, the shared partition wall is not as cracked up as it, or it's more cracked up than it should be. And you're experiencing the life, one is experiencing the life of the neighbors, living their life, whether they realize it or not. You are intimately connected with them. You basically hear them having sex, going to the toilet, and having very personal arguments, going through emotional states, which I'm sure is also affecting the narrator, maybe even the house, if the house is absorbing, those emotional states, those sounds, those life points, as if it is a stone tape, I'm imagining that. And I think about commoning as also a kind of doubling or in that regard. And I think after that, we can talk about mirroring and maybe ventriloquism, because they also feel like doublings.
I think it's so interesting, this, like you used the word discretion a minute ago, and I think that the politics of sort of being discrete or a discrete body is quite interesting. And this inhibited sort of quietness or uninhibited loudness that we sort of implement on ourselves or on other people. And then also, the kind of active overhearing or eavesdropping, whether it's kind of welcomed or not. I mean, and for the protagonist, there's this sort of ambivalence to whether or not they kind of really, they want to feel connected. And there's these kind of points where it's definitely voyeuristic, almost kind of indulging in other people's emotions as a sort of reflection or projection of their own experience, or trying to find a way into their own experiences. And Yeah, there's also this kind of the bit with the canned laughter seeping in, and this kind of laughing along, or this sort of desperate attempt, I guess, at finding connection that happens there.
And also that laughter, I mean, for me at least, it's contagious, right? You can't help but laugh if someone else is laughing, even if it's maybe out of context. It kind of makes you have to laugh, or at least smile when you hear someone else doing, or see someone else maybe a little bit like yawning. This idea of canned laughing being created by a layering as well of voices. So, I mean, that's interesting in that, you know, it's lots of probably quite disparate people laughing and being recorded and then being added together. So it's it's an imaginary communion in a way. You know, it's not a real life communion, in that it's people's voices being superimposed on one another. And I suppose that is a nice link back to the narrator living their life through, or by proxy, the life of the neighbour as they laugh and cry through life. And it kind of feels like that separateness is sort of brought together in that sense. So we've spoken before, and you did bring up ventriloquism, and you know, if you read about it, it's like this idea of double voicing. And I think when we talk about this idea of our edges, our skins, our surfaces not being quite as distinct as maybe you would like them to be, it almost feels to me like the narrator is also ventriloquizing the neighbours. I mean, they're talking about living by proxy, but also the house and the environment, and giving voice to something else. I suppose that's the idea of what ventriloquism is. So I sort of had that in mind.
Yeah, so there's these kind of references to etymology in the work, and this kind of like rooting things in language. And the word, or ventriloquism, means from the Greek speaking from the belly. And so this is a kind of interest that I had about this idea of the gut and speech from the gut, and the way that this kind of circulation, I suppose, of voice within the body and then spilling outside, or also the voice becoming a sort of object which is thrown around a room, and that has a kind of effect on the audience, but also on the space that it inhabits, that it becomes something outside of the body, or detached in some way. But yeah, this kind of idea of things about circulation and the sort of parallels between the gut and plumbing. And
no, that's really fascinating, and it's making me think, you know, listening to your gut, literally you have neurons in your gut, so that's like a gut brain, I think other people call it. So we should absolutely be listening to our guts. And what are humans anyway? I think we're made of a far higher percentage of bacteria and fungi and other things than we are human cells, and that's enough to make you think about that kind of discrete, that sack of bones and muscle and, you know, fat and all these other things, which also is brought up in the work.
I was told that in Italian, to hear means also to feel, and in Greek, to listen means also to obey. They say you should listen to your gut, but mine is unreliable. The house is digesting, water is filling up from under the floor. I wade through dirty puddles to reach the microwave. Every night's dinner date, something easy, something salty, ideally something to make me feel European. Lasagna, cannelloni, macaroni cheese. I watch the meal turning in a container that will likely outlive me and remember me once on an aeroplane. I'm in the middle seat, the worst one.
Nestled between strangers.
Watching a mediocre film about losing your senses in every sense, with each loss preceded by intense, panicked indulgence. Here is me, absent-minded, wet pasta and a plastic fork, facing opposite Ewan McGregor or someone like him. I'm drunk on tiny bottles and he's consumed too, glugging down olive oil until it spills from his mouth. I chew on stale bread roll while Ewan batters on raw meat and rotten eggs, sugar, salt and lemons like a dog in a reckless splurge, in the moments before taste disappears forever. The macaroni goes cold without my attention. Are you going to finish that? Stranger next to me asks. Let's share it.
Actually, listening to the gut reminds me of this feeling of transformation, which seems possibly not a positive thing, but it might actually be something that is really interesting to sort of work around. And that was when you were talking about the mold forming on the walls and it becoming like this beautiful wallpaper, I suppose. And actually maybe it's like a lack in the so-called human that we can't appreciate. I mean, obviously you don't literally want that in your house because it's not good for the health, but in a work where you can kind of take yourself out of reality to some extent, this idea of the walls growing and becoming alive is actually really interesting. And it reminded me, I suppose, of the narrator or yourself as you're in the space listening. You're also in the environment of the listening chamber within the Jerwood space. It almost feels like you're in the belly of something. That kind of almost kind of womb-like space as well, that kind of takes you out of your human body as a listener, so you can just focus on what you're listening to, and your responses to that is quite interesting. And I think you talked about Vera Baxter, the film, Margaret Duras, sorry, my French. And I think within that film, she has a very particular idea of how to work characters, and that is to sort of place them in the head. And so I suppose in some ways the way that you've constructed the work as an installation and that envelopment that you have is a nice kind of mirroring of her ideas of placing you in your head, sort of a removing of your body, but at the same time you're reminded that you are a body and that you are biological at the same time. So I suppose there are more observations than anything, but it's sort of just come out of this idea of listening to the gut, you know, which actually is really beautiful.
Thanks. Yeah, the way that she composes those scenes and those films and the kind of broken voiceover that happens there, I find really interesting. And also, yeah, the kind of staging of the space. It was important to me that there was this kind of reference to domesticity, so that the print is the height of a dado rail. And yeah, like you said, the mold becomes wallpaper, but also that it becomes something else, and the walls kind of become the sound, or the sound comes from the walls, which is why they're positioned in the way that they are, kind of up high and facing downwards, so that the architecture is the thing that kind of is speaking. So yeah, thank you. That's I mean, in Vera Baxter as well, it's not really about the narrative of the film. It's just this relentless jingle. Again, like that kind of earworm thing that we were talking about before, but this relentless jingle that's happening from somewhere else, that's coming in from outside, that's sort of infiltrating their conversation and your experience of the film, and sort of in lots of ways taking you out of it, or you sort of drift in and out of awareness, I guess, of these two things that are competing, the voice and the music, and that's really interesting to me, that these two things aren't necessarily always compatible.
I mean, just my response to that is it surely comes through. I mean, polyphony, and I keep talking about these various characters of the weather and of the narrator and the landlord and the neighbours. You know, they're all voices in themselves, even if they're being ventriloquized, and they're all speaking together. But also there is the voice of the music, which I think is a really strong and integral feature. You've spoken about these various shifts in tone or feeling or emotion through the work. You know, there's these various, maybe quite subtle structures in the background, but I think that actually does bring the person who's in the installation and listening through the work and actually through the feelings and through that kind of opening up of one's own body, one's own ears. And as I said in the piece that I wrote for you, that kind of you become the room, you actually kind of embody a lot of the things that you're actually talking about, or that are insinuated possibly sort of in the text or through the music.
This experience of listening that we were talking about, or of being in the space, that was why I really wanted to work with collective text to think about the captioning. So to think about sort of how, just because it was a sound installation, that how that could be more accessible to a wider audience, or how that space kind of holds you. So I guess that's another collaboration in the work, was with collective text and Kieran Stewart, who's a deaf actor and writer and captioning consultant. So those conversations were really valuable to think about the kind of language that's used to describe sound, and the sort of mistakes that I made when writing the captioning script in terms of describing sound in relation to other sounds and things like that, and the way that you sort of describe sound more accurately in relation to feeling or experience. That whole kind of process of translation was really, really interesting. And yeah, so every play in the installation every other play is captioned. I suppose it's another way of sort of thinking about text in the work, but the captions here serve like a very particular purpose with a particular audience in mind.
I think the captioning is really fascinating because it does actually question one's assumptions of who attends artworks. But captioning is an interesting one because I think you can think of it in a super creative sense, or you can think of it as a kind of very utilitarian thing. And I'm sure there are many people in many boats in terms of how one would like that to be used. And I mean, in an art context, I suppose you kind of have to have your eyes and ears on all of those different ways of utilizing captioning. But I always find when I go to sound installations, there's still this unsaid thing of the golden ears, the kind of normative way one hears. So even the MP3, the way it's constructed, it's, compression is around algorithms that have been created around a data set which was, they were taken many years ago. They were of university students, and I think they were all male and possibly all white male candidates. So again, there's a lot of things hidden in what we assume about listening, which is also really fascinating. And it's something that I'm just, I'll never get to grips with, but it's something that I'm trying to problematize a little bit more. And I think actually the captioning in your work is a really strong reference to the fact that people listen in lots of different ways. And sometimes it's through the eyes, sometimes it's through the ears, the iconic ear, and sometimes it's actually through the whole of the body. And in fact, we're doing that a lot, which is why that light motif from the Landlord was so penetrating, because you're listening with your whole body. Everything is vibrating. Your guts are vibrating. Your liver is vibrating. Your lungs are vibrating, and it's telling you something. So yeah, that's, I think, a really, really important part of the work. And it's beautifully considered as well in terms of the way it looks.
Communication is sexy.
I suppose there's also there's a observation or possibly a question about, I think, texture in a way. So sort of surface, but also texture. So in the installation, you've got the marbled wall, which I think makes one think about the sea, the inevitability of the sea. You always end up at the sea. The water knows how to get home, so to speak. But then in the work as a whole as well, there's the musical elements are also textures. And if you sort of detune your listening, there are the textures of the surfaces of the voices as well, which are, kind of distorted. Well, not distorted, the music is distorted and slowed in a way that can be seen as a very specific kind of surface, but maybe a surface that's kind of more like a skin. It feels kind of more explorational in a way, like it tells you a lot about what's going on within the work as well, or it certainly backs it up.
I think in a lot of the work, not just with this, but in general, there's this feeling of things being brought in and out of focus. So it happens in the film work in a kind of literal sense, but I think it also happens sort of narratively and in the sort of textures of sound. But this idea of things being brought up and forward or buried kind of happens in different ways, or I'm interested in it in different ways. The print has this sort of inky, watery surface, but it could also feel sort of geological. And also, as I was sort of zoning in on that when I was working on making it, there's something kind of cosmological. Is that a word? There's a sort of cosmological imagery in that. And, you know, like you only see the surface of the sky, for example. You only see the surface of the sea most of the time. So that, yeah, there's a kind of depth, I guess, in that I'm alluding to. But yeah, I'm quite sort of sensitive to texture in all its forms, and that kind of physical aesthetic experience is important to me if I'm constructing a space for people to sit in, or I'm asking people to stay somewhere for a while or stay with the work or whatever. That physical experience is really important to me.
When I listen to the work, and obviously the more I listen to the work, the more I think comes through in the work, because it is so layered. So what's the phrase? Is it calm waters run deep, or something like that, isn't it? Just the surface is smooth, but underneath everything is writhing and there's lots of stuff going on. And it does remind me of something called the critical zone as well. In some ways, it's that area of the earth near the surface where there's lots of complex interactions. So rock, soil, water, air, and living organisms as well that sort of, you know, come together to regulate their habitat. And it almost feels like within the work that's also going on, really. Like there's the critical zone, and actually at the end or towards the end of the work, again, not to give the game away, there is a moment where maybe the critical zone is breached, and then all of these other transformations occur. I'm being quite oblique with this because I don't want to tell people how the piece ends up. yeah, they've probably already listened to it by now. But like it feels like critical zone is critical because it's important to life, but also it can be quite easily disbalanced, I suppose, and that's where the negative things start, or the negative things for human existence, I suppose, and other existences start to occur. So environmental breakdown. And I think we touched on it a little bit in terms of scale, and when, I suppose it's the difference between when weather and atmosphere, so to speak, become climate crisis. And I think within the work, there's some super big themes, sort of, they're definitely seeping out of those pores as well. Those everyday activities are really kind of a nod towards these systems which are breaking down, like quite literally in front of our eyes. And what does one do about it? Obviously that does cause anxiety, which I suppose relates back to the protagonist, the narrator at the start, kind of being very anxious about something that seems like it hasn't quite happened yet, but maybe it already has. Again, this kind of linking back to time and how one perceives time. I'm not sure how this is going to end. There's an artist called Nick Forrest, and they actually were part of one of the auraldiversities talks recently, and there was a big group of them, and they all come up with these kind of, I guess, sonic meditations. And one of the things that they said was, how might sound gather listeners into a powerful relation, or into powerful relation? And I just think that your work totally does that, because everything is relational in the work. Nothing is fixed. Everything is temporary, which is nice, because I think it links to the work that you did in Japan as well, where I think one of the cards that kind of flashes up on the screen is everything is temporary, and then there's some Japanese text written underneath. And I just thought, yeah, I mean, that's what I feel about life as well. Everything is temporary, and that's why it's so beautiful at the same time, because you don't need to reach out and grasp and try and hold to understand things. They life unfolds and you shape it, but it's never fixed. It's constantly morphing and changing and shifting and transmogrifying, if you want a posh word for it. So that might be like a question that one could end on, and then you can have some sound playing out, if that makes sense. But see how it goes. It might not work, and then might end somewhere else.